Hi there, it's Claire. If you're hearing me, that means you're listening to the free preview of one of our Patreon episodes. We switch off every week between free and Patreon exclusive episodes, so if you'd like to hear the rest of this conversation, head over to patreon.com/thisguysucked and join our honorary haters club. Welcome to This Guy Sucked, the show where we prove that it's never too late to have haters and you can't libel the dead. I'm your host, Dr. Claire Aubin, and I'm a historian, writer, and most importantly, certified hater. On this show, we talk about people from throughout history with legacies that need a little updating. Whether it's because of their politics, their behavior, or their impact on society and culture, these guys actually kind of sucked, and we bring in a new scholar every week to tell us why. With me today is Dr. Matt Lodder, who is a senior lecturer, aka associate professor in American terms, in art history and theory, as well as the director of American Studies at the University of Essex. He is also the host of the excellent tattoo history podcast Beneath the Skin, which I was recently on, so you might be here from hearing me on that, and the author of several books on the history of tattooing, including Painted People, 5,000 Years of Tattooed History, and the brand new book, Tattoos, The Untold History of a Modern Art. He's also just kind of a generally lovely chap. So welcome to the show, and congratulations on your new book.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad I'm not the guy that sucks.
Well, that remains to be seen.
Oh, yeah, okay, fair enough. We've started. Okay, we're just getting going.
I want to start off by saying that we have many things in common, but one of them looms, I think, larger than the rest, and that is our shared producer and your Beneath the Skin co-host, Tom O'Mani. So now's your opportunity to say mean things about him while he's forced to sit here and listen silently, the sort of cucking of the podcast world, if you were. So warm-up question.
I don't need that in this podcast. I do that to his face anyway.
Warm-up question today is, what's your least favorite thing about him?
No, Tom's amazing. I don't need to get him where he can't respond, because I do this both off air and on air on our podcast. So Tom's amazing. He doesn't suck. My least favorite thing about him is he's better looking than me, which is embarrassing when I'm in the room with him. His beauty outshines mine.
He also does work out quite a lot, which is annoying if you're not someone
he's pretty hench.
Yeah, in all actuality, Tom's a legend and a secret lurker in all of these episodes. For those of you listening at home, there's a third party that you're not aware of. I would never deign to insult him lest he make me sound really bad forever and ruin our working relationship. My least favorite thing about him is that he's too good at his job.
Yeah.
He did also threaten to edit out anything mean that we said about him. So who knows if listeners are even hearing this. Let's get into what we're actually here for. Who are we talking about today?
Well, as probably most people who've been on this show with you already, Claire, there was a sort of longish list of people. I think just to be an academic, you have to have, people whose work you're engaging with in a kind of critical way, and many of those people whom we criticize suck. But I guess one guy looms particularly large over my field insofar as he kind of determines the questions that I get asked by journalists quite frequently, even more than a century since he died in 1909. So I want to talk to you today about Cesare Lombroso, the Italian criminologist working in Turin in Italy in about 1850 to 1890 odd and slightly afterwards.
So he's known for a lot of things, which you can kind of take us through, but he's allegedly the sort of first criminologist, or is one of these guys who coined the term criminology. Is that right?
Yeah, he gets kind of hailed as the father of criminology, kind of criminology as a modern science. It really was super influential in sort of setting up the methods of the early sort of study of criminology, which is essentially a kind of, in his version, and to today to some degree as well, a combination of psychology, psychiatry, and sociology. He's interested primarily in kind of what makes criminals tick, and as we'll come to, what makes criminals different from us wonderful non-criminal people, the law-abiding, good, solid, upstanding people of the world. In order to do that, he developed a huge sort of body of literature. His most famous book, I suppose, is called the Criminal Man, literally called The Criminal Man, which was published in the 1870s, translated frequently, or translated into English in 1911. Went through several editions. His daughter also kind of took on his legacy. Yeah, like as I said, really kind of set the stage for the entire modern field of criminology.
So much so that his brain or his head is literally in the Museum of Criminology and Psychiatry in Italy. Like, you could see his brain/head there, which is wild to me.
Yeah, well, he, as we'll go on to talk about, a huge part of his method was literally measuring skulls. You know, he's the skull measuring guy, or one of them. A huge part of his, well, after he died, he basically said, look, if I've been measuring people's skulls my whole life, I want my skull to be measured after I die. And so he left his skull for a measuring. I actually was trying to find actually like what people discovered about measuring his skull. I wasn't actually, I'm sure that it is out there, but I wasn't able to locate that information in time to talk about it on today's show. But, you know, he I guess he believed that, you know, his head was not indicative of anything other than good, upstanding, non-criminal behavior. You know, he sort of stood by that.
For those at home who sort of don't understand this whole skull measuring thing, so Lombroso is a phrenologist, which is, or a sort of proponent of phrenology, which is the study of people's skulls in order to determine their sort of internal personality characteristics, like using calipers, which is like a measuring instrument. Which now is like a sort of a funny thing, like get out the calipers, because it's just something we used to say for someone being essentially racist. It was this thing where people would measure your skull and they could say, based on the distance between your eyes, you're more likely to be a kind person or a murderer or stupid or whatever it is, in order to sort of establish a relationship between your appearance and your internal characteristics, your personality, the likelihood of you engaging in certain behaviors, etc.
Yeah, well, so, you know, the idea that what you looked like determined what kind of person you are is a like very, very old idea indeed. Like, goes back to the, you know, ancient world, and you know, there's long been a kind of I mean, it's, you know, it's even in the Bible, right? This idea that there's some kind of reflection of your moral character to be found on your body. You know, phrenology has antecedent sciences in inverted commas. Of physiognomy and basically this idea that you basically could tell, as you said, like what kind of person you are based on what you look like. But Lombroso's coming to his sort of scientific career, if you like, at a time when those like really ancient ideas are becoming kind of part of the modern scientific method set, right? When you know, in the kind of 19th century with industrialization and the birth of kind of modern positivist science, Lombroso is sort of taking those very, very old and in some senses quite kind of intuitive ideas, I suppose, and trying to apply to them like modern statistical methods and also modern ideas about inheritance and you know, genetics as we call it today, post Darwin. He's also working at a time when European colonialism is really kind of taking another gear, and his work is both driving and responding to those new kinds of scientific racism that are occurring in the context of colonialism in North Africa and in the Pacific.
Yeah, and this is really a moment, and this happens obviously even now, but this is a moment where there is a desire to really quantify and find in hard science, find things like prejudice, or find a sort of scientific, unambiguous, concrete reason for things that exist, like racial prejudice. And so this idea of creating science that like allows these prejudices to exist and continue is really popular at that time, like in a lot of different ways and by a lot of different people.
Right. And you know, one of the degrees that I run at Essex is a joint degree with American Studies and Criminology. And often I interview students to come onto that program, and you say, why do you want to study criminology? And their answer is always like, I want to know what makes criminals tick, right? And it should be said probably right up top that for all of his influence on the beginning of the field, for a very long time, there has been a sense, I mean, even again, as we'll probably get into, or we will get into, even Lombroso's peers very quickly noticed some quite glaring methodological errors in his work, right? And modern Lombrosian studies, I suppose, do sort of acknowledge those flaws. But I was, I was kind of struck by, and this has been happening over the last sort of decade or so, there is a bit of an attempt to kind of rehabilitate at least some of his methods. I mean, there was a paper published back in 2017 by a scholar called Elisabetta Cigliovani at New York University in a journal of the history of medicine in Italy, where basically she says, and I'll read the abstract of the paper, like, Italian physician and anthropologist Lombroso established a foundation of criminological sciences by introducing a biological theory of delinquency, which was later discredited and replaced by the sociological approach. The theory of the born criminal was poor in methods and analysis and turned out to be controversial in its formulations, assumptions, and mostly its predictions. However, big however, lads, recent research in behavioral genetics and neuroscience has brought back some version of the Lombrosian idea by providing evidence for the genetic and biological correlates of criminality. This research has been impacting legal proceedings worldwide. And then she says, to go on the one hand, this paper argues against the idea that contemporary theories are radically deterministic, while on the other hand, it aims at rehabilitating the intellectual image of Lombroso by showing the denigration of his brilliant work by his successors was unjustified.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So a huge amount of like contemporary behavioral genetics, and also, there's lots of work kind of criticizing the Lombrosian nature of things like facial recognition algorithms in contemporary criminological and, police work. So, yeah, these ideas are sticky, and, they have a huge kind of complicated and intermix of prejudice and data and poor methods and desire to discover something that, probably is worth discovering, which are the causes of criminality and antisocial behavior. But even though, again, to be totally fair on my criminological colleagues, most modern criminology has understood that the Lombrosian skull measuring stuff is not actually the way to figure out what causes crime. There are huge amounts of kind of evolutionary psychology, forensic science, forensic psychology as well, which want to kind of use different kind of tools to measure something in the body that is imagined to give rise to delinquency.
It seems like thus far, there are kind of two categories of guys who sucked on the show so far. One who is kind of remembered for not sucking, like is revered in some way, but actually sucked. And then the other, and this latter category, which I think Lombroso falls into, is a guy who is not publicly remembered or revered in any massive way or outside of their field and really sucked, or in some way kind of set the conditions for life as we now know it through the way that they sucked. And I think he falls into that category in that most people will not be familiar with him, but he messed a lot of stuff up for a lot of people. And so I think it's important also to talk a little bit about how he gets to the point where he starts working on this stuff. So like you said, he's Italian. He's born in Verona. He had medical training. He went to medical school at the University of Pavia in Italy. In 1859, he became an army surgeon. And then about 7 years later, he became a visiting lecturer at the university where he did his medical training. So he has like a sort of level of sort of credential and like respect already at that point. In 1871, he becomes the head of Pesaro, also Italian, their insane asylum. And this is where I think his personal suckitude kind of ascends. And that's where because he starts with some of this stuff earlier. And then after he starts heading this insane asylum, and particularly for the sort of like criminally insane, that's where a lot of this stuff really, really begins. He begins studying the physical bodies of the criminally insane and becomes a sort of criminal anthropologist. And that's sort of how he shapes his life from there on out. In 1878, he moves to Turin, becomes a professor of forensic medicine and hygiene. And that is the moment in which he writes his book, Criminal Man, which you mentioned earlier. He also has a follow-up book called Criminal Woman, because it's different.
Well, No, so the thing with the Criminal Woman book, I mean, it's so interesting. So again, as we'll talk about, like his basic theory is that criminals are a sort of lesser subspecies of human being, right? It's basically his theory, which has kind of causes and implications that we'll get into. But he also thinks that in some senses, women are a lower form of life than men. But at the same time, right? So at the same time, women commit crime at lower rates than men, and did do even in the 19th century. And so he's got these two conflicting theories of like lesser beings are more likely to commit crime. And he has a kind of teleological, evolutionary or pseudo-evolutionary argument underpinning that, right? Where he thinks that the less evolved you are, I mean, so many air quotes around all these words for people listening without benefit of video. Like, he believes basically the less evolved you were, the more kind of atavistic and primitive a type you were, the more inclined to criminal behavior you were. But he also believed that women were closer to that than men, but also that doesn't fit with the other part of the other leg of his theory that women commit crime less frequently. So he ends up like he's got to pick racism or misogyny, and he can't quite deal with it.